Okay, well, good afternoon to everybody. Hopefully everybody can hear me okay. And if you can't hear me, let me know, and I'll be more than glad to try to figure out what's happening. But so far we've had pretty good success, I think, with the volume in this room. I've got the auto transcription on, so hopefully if that helps you. If you miss anything, that's that's there for you to see. So so we're going to go ahead and get started today, and again, I just want to sort of give a bit of a where we are in the schedule, because we're in, this is week 7 of the 15-week course. And you might have noticed that last week we didn't have for week 6 a piece for the Marx and Engels. And for whatever reason, I omitted them when I was creating the syllabus. My mistake, but I felt it was an important piece to put in there. So we sort of inserted that. And then so what looks like it's week 8 is actually going to be week 7. And that's talking about the Keynesian theory. And we'll talk more about his work throughout the class session today. So, and then we're scheduled next week to have our first exam. And let me talk a bit about what that exam is going to look like. It'll be available in Brightspace, and it'll be available probably beginning like late Thursday night. And it'll be available through, I guess that would be the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, I want to say, something like that. So, and as to the format of this, let me see if I can scroll over here so you can see this okay. The format of the exam is going to be, and it's going to be all done in Brightspace. So it'll be 10 true-false questions. So 10 true-false questions. There'll be 10 multiple choice answers, multiple guess. So 10 multiple, I'm sorry, 20 multiple choice. Sorry about that. 20 multiple choice questions. And then there are going to be 10 fill-in-the-blank questions. 10 fill-in-the-blank questions. And the fill-in-the-blank could be multiple words. I mean, I guess you could say maybe it's a short answer if you want to say that, but it doesn't require an essay or anything of that nature. I don't want anybody to get the idea that you're having to write an essay, but it's more of a word, 2 words, whatever. And because these will have to be manually reviewed by me, it'll probably be a few days before you actually get the results back on this. I'll try to review it as quickly as I can and be able to provide the feedback. On exams, usually the exams are auto-graded when they're true, false, and multiple choice, meaning that you've got the answers right away, as they are on the quizzes. And those are designed to be that way so that you can get your answers right away. I've also put a time delay on those. By the way, I don't know if I've talked about this before. As to the quizzes, not the exam, this is exam 1, and there are only 2 exams in the course, and so you can think of this as a midterm exam, if you like, 8 weeks of the 15 weeks. So it's sort of the midpoint period here. And I'll spend a bit of time next week in class talking about the exam before we leave. So probably the last half an hour of class, I'll review for the exam so that you have an idea of what to look out for, because 7 or 8 weeks of material is quite a lot in terms of total content covered. So I want to make sure that you're focusing on the right areas and whatnot. But because it's an open book exam, open research, just as your quizzes are, you have all the resources available to work with. It'll be set at 90 minutes for the exam. So you want to make sure that you allot yourself enough time to take that. Unlike the quizzes, you only have one opportunity to take that. That's just the way that the exam program works in this course. So you'll have, so make sure well, I always tell students, and I'll probably say the same thing again to you next week, when you're doing an exam and it's 90 minutes, it's a little bit different than the quizzes where you can take a quiz and maybe you get cut off, maybe you get a phone call or whatever. You can always go back in and take it multiple times again and again and again in that week for which it's assigned. That's not the case with exams. And so try to find yourself a comfortable place, get a nice hot beverage or whatever it is you want to do, get comfortable, and that way you can settle in order to take the exam. And again, you have all the resources available that you want to use in order to be able to take that. And I'll give you a bit of more heads up next week as to what to look for, what to focus on, because we do cover quite a lot of ground in terms of content, and but there aren't very many exams in the course per se, and so there you go, I can see it a little bit better now. There aren't that many exams. There are a number of. You want to make sure that you have the opportunity to do a good job on that. So that's what is going to be discussed there. Also, on the On the discussions, make sure everybody is participating in the discussions on a weekly basis. I think some of the participation here is sort of hit and miss, and I just want to make sure you're aware. Just to, I know I've said this pretty much every week now, but you want to go in and make an initial post by Thursday of every week, and then follow one other post. It doesn't have to be large and gigantic. I know some people really get very prolific on these, and that's fine. I mean, it's okay to go long, but you don't have to. And I don't want anybody to think that you ever have to do things like find sources and do citations and footnotes, unless, of course, you're quoting material directly, which I would sort of discourage you from doing. And I think on the discussion guidelines link that I posted in Brightspace, I think I sort of discouraged you from doing that. You shouldn't have to quote anybody at all whatsoever. In fact, that's really not the intent. The intent is for you to provide your own content as to what your interpretation is of the material, the question at hand. I know the book that we've got covers a lot of different ground, and as I've said before, it's probably not the best suited for this particular course material, but nonetheless, it's the discussion is on extreme details within the book, so I don't think you have to worry about some strange, or on the exams themselves, on some really obscure point from page 238 or some random content. Okay, so that's what's going on with the exam, and we'll talk more about that next time, and that way you'll be familiar with what's happening. So whatever we're going to cover for the period, the classical school leading up to that first exam, we will defer and put that back in the second exam. And by the way, the second exam is not comprehensive, so it won't go back to day one. It'll only cover the material that we've covered since that first exam, and I should have mentioned that. But so it will not be comprehensive. And again, but we'll obviously, as we get closer to that second exam in December, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so questions about that and anything I can answer for anybody. One other thing, it looks like everybody has gotten their names put in. That's good. Occasionally, I'm still downloading. What happens is Zoom will, for me to take attendance, Zoom basically has an export file. It basically goes to a spreadsheet, and however you log in, and sometimes it's a default if you're on an iPad or whatever, or whatever, it'll just simply say that iPhone or whatever, which means I don't know who that is. And so this is the way you record your attendance. There's no credit for attendance per se, but the thing about it is we're required by the government to record attendance because we do one of those institutions that accepts for the federal student aid. So we're required to record everyone's attendance. So just make sure that you are able to do that. It looks like everybody here has gotten that, so that's good. So are there any questions about anything we've talked about up to this point? Any questions I can answer for you about anything before we get started with today's content? Well, if you do, feel free. You can always just unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm more than glad to engage in a dialogue. It's not a problem. We're a small enough group. This is not a big lecture hall of 400 people where it's a little bit unwieldy, so feel free to do that. Also I've got the chat box open. If I'm sort of wandering around the room, I might not see the chat comments until I get back here, but nonetheless, if you do have comments, feel free to put those in there as well. Or even if it's something that you think the whole class can benefit from, feel free to go ahead and put a comment in there. Okay. All right. Just so I just want to sort of back up a little bit before we go into talking about where we are. I just want to sort of frame the overall discussion of where we are in this class, because the first few weeks, we sort of focused on some of the fundamentals of economics. We talked about what some of the basic concepts are, like who are the actors, households, firms, and governments. We talked about the production of goods and this idea of choice as a function of scarcity, that we can only do so much. And so if we do more of one thing, we have to give up doing something of something else. And I know that was presented as a production model, but it's also got consumption possibilities as well. And for those of you who go on to take a micro course, you'll see that come up again and again, this idea of choice as a function of scarcity, that we can't do it all. We've got to decide what to do. And so because we have to decide what to do, we need to defer doing something else or not do it at all, in which case the value of whatever that thing is we gave up is what we call opportunity cost. We gave up the opportunity to do that. And if you look at throughout almost any economics website that deals with this idea of opportunity cost, you'll see this idea of people making decisions where they give up something that would seem valuable to a lot of people. Examples being somebody like Tiger Woods, who leaves college to go play golf. Well, you can always go back to college, and I think we've sort of made this statement before. You can always go back to college, but you may not be always in a condition to play professional golf. And so from that standpoint, he was minimizing his opportunity cost. Yes, it's important maybe to go and get an education so you can have a one career, earn more income a lifetime. But if you can earn super amounts of money as a pro golfer, that is considered to be a rational economic decision. It's a personal decision, though. Maybe he decided he didn't want to do it. We have seen cases before where people have foregone becoming pro athletes in order to go to medical school or to go back to college or whatever. So it's a personal choice. And this is why these personal decisions make a big difference. So we covered a lot of these different areas of economics early on, just so that you've got a background. So as we get into some of the history of economic thinking, pricing and all that. But in order for us to really understand and to get into the third section, which deals with very current economic events, when we designed the course, we kind of thought it was appropriate and important to get into this idea of sort of bringing us up to speed as to where we are now and how we got here. This industrial society, this mostly urbanized society where we leave home to go to work. We don't work from home usually, although that has obviously been subject to change with the pandemic and whatnot. But nonetheless, the idea of not working for ourselves, on our own plot of land, that still holds, working usually for other people. And it's not household labor necessarily. It's working, outside of the workplace. So so how do we get there, and what's it all about? And furthermore, what is the thinking about economic justice, the economic future as we go forward? All these things are important as we talk about it. So we talked a bit about the first three economists, and I want to make clear those are by no means the only three early economists we talked about: Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Thomas Malthus. They're just three of the big prominent names from the late 18th, early 19th centuries that sort of laid a lot of foundation for what were topics to be discussed as that century progressed and as we got into the 20th century. And some of those topics, frankly, are still relevant today, particularly in terms of population. And I thought we had a really good discussion in the Brightspace course site about population and all that it means. And as the world's population is set to double in another few years, then the question is, is there a breaking point? And Malthus thought the breaking point was way lower than what it is. As it turns out, he probably was a little wrong. Well, I think he was wrong. He probably didn't foresee the tremendous expansion of supply that was possible through technology. And so he missed that, but is he wrong ultimately? Because if we keep doubling the population, will we run out of resources? Will we run out of the things necessary to support life? It's an important question. And I think those are questions we're going to have to deal with. Also things like resource economics. We're going to talk more about pollution. We're going to talk a bit about global climate change. All that's coming toward the end. So we sort of want to lay this foundation. And I think that we laid the idea of conflicting views for ourselves as to our notion of what economic life is and what it should be. We talked about Adam Smith, who today I think is sort of put in the category of being a fairly conventional sort of pro-capitalist sort of thinker. But I want to sort of put it more in the context of his writing as being sort of revolutionary and sort of radical for its time. The idea that government, you should stay out of the way, let people do what they want, produce and consume as they like, and to get away from the old landowning classes, which, frankly, were simply hereditary nobility and carried on for century after century. All they were really up to is collecting rents from people, and the people actually did the work. And so, from that standpoint, was it an improvement that we go to an industrial society from that landowning sort of base? That's a question that is subjective. I think we all sort of different. But if you put Smith in that context, who is fairly optimistic about that future, versus Marx, who's fairly pessimistic, and so is, frankly, Malthus, it's important we talk about Marx because I think he presents sort of a contrasting point of view. It's sort of a point where we say, okay, there's a different point of view. It's much more pessimistic. And I know Marx is a controversial figure. I get that. But I want to make clear that there's a reason why we talk about Marx's work, because it does sort of lay the foundation for a lot of what thinking that is to come, if for no other reason than to sort of contrast with where he's been. And we're going to certainly talk today about the work of John Maynard Keynes, who definitely contrasted with Marx in terms of his interpretation. By the way, Marx's work is so voluminous that I think it has the tendency to be mischaracterized and oversimplified. And I know that I probably didn't do a lot of favors when I encapsulated his economic thinking in one PowerPoint slide. And I told you, I said it was a little ridiculous, but I also don't want to inundate you with slide after slide after slide, because I realize you get diminishing returns the more I overwhelm you with that. Instead, I'd rather give you more of a bit of commentary as to what his work is about. There's no shortage of material out there on Marx. I provided some links, YouTube links that are fairly short in nature, allow you to have a bit of view on his work. So I realize it's fairly voluminous, but here's the thing: even if you disagree with his central idea about labor and labor exploitation, one of the things that opens, well, academics, frankly, to criticism is the idea that they tend to oversimplify his work when it comes to his overall view, because the point of competition is missing here. And that is the idea that it's not just economic life can be hard for those on the bottom end, those who are the workers, but it's also tough on those who are the competing capitalists. And this is something that he was really one of the very first in the academic literature to talk about competition. The competition in this new system of rivalry and going after business and trying to chase market share can be equally tough on those who own the factors of production, not just on those who have to work the factors. And that they can easily fall down out of their lofty space if they're not able to compete. So it's this idea of competition being introduced into the world of capitalism, and which he referred to as the cash nexus. And by the way, when we talk about Keynes, he will also talk about what capitalism has brought, this idea of focusing on wealth accumulation. And is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? So we'll have to see. So anyway, so that's kind of where we are in a little bit of a roundabout way. What I did want to talk about today is to sort of give us, sort of bring us a little bit into the modern world here a bit, and to take us into modern macroeconomic thinking. Remember, sorry about that. Everything's backwards on this thing here, so when I hit left, it goes right. So when we talk about macroeconomics, we're talking about the big picture. So kind of go back and think about macro as being the entire economy, including the global economy. So just kind of sort of reimagine that. Now, why don't we have a slide on the schools of microeconomic thought? Well, it's a little bit beyond where we're going to go in this course. For those of you who will take microeconomics, you'll certainly get that on your own. But what we're interested here in is talking about some of the schools of macro thought. And there are really two main schools. We're going to cover the Keynesian today, and then next week we'll get into a bit of the classical. If we don't finish the classical school and some of its various subfields, and there are a lot of different branches of that school, then we'll carry that over to the next week. One of the good things about our schedule is that we've deliberately built in flexibility so that we can cover topics, go long, go short, whatever, if that's the case. So I want to talk about the Keynesian school. First of all, one of the things that is a direct descendant of Marxian thinking is this idea of crisis economics. And I think that, and Malthus also talks about crisis economics as well. And today, if you, there's some work out there that talks about the fact that the economy, as it is subject and prone to various crises. We sort of lurch from one crisis to the next crisis. If you look, just go back from even the beginning of this century, this fairly young 21st century, we've had an economic recession, sort of exacerbated by the terrorist attacks of 9/11, but also we went from there to a boom-bust cycle in real estate, which ended very badly. We had a number of bank failures. The banks themselves didn't go down. They were instead were sort of joined together. Some of the banks that were going to fail were sort of put into league with other banks that were not failing. We came out of that. Then we had a boom in stocks, and we've had a couple busts in the stock market. Right now, we're in the middle of one right now. For those of us who own stocks, we're sort of riding this wave downward. You know, these are things that are even beyond the macroeconomic performance. We see these boom bust, rises and falls in asset prices. We've seen low interest rates. We're seeing now higher interest rates. So the idea is that economic life is very unstable. And I know that Malthus certainly talked about that with regard to the mismatch between population growth and food supply. Marx talked about the idea that capitalism itself was unstable and eventually could not sustain itself. I think he was probably wrong. I think that instead, the supply side has been able to produce more output than what I think anybody has imagined. I mean, today, just the US economy produces $24 trillion of output, and that's about 6 times the increase over the last 40 years, whereas the population's only grown by about 50%. I think we did that sort of math several weeks ago. And so as a result, because we're able to produce more, scarcity is actually going down, not up. We still have crises that happen from time to time, and what to do about it is the question. So when we talk about the work of John Maynard Keynes, we're going to talk about this idea of crisis as being the precondition for his work becoming prominent. So the actor here his name is John Maynard Keynes. It's pronounced Keynes. It looks like Keynes, spelled almost like Alicia Keys, the singer. But Keynes was an interesting character. And one thing about Keynes, I think we should give a bit of a background. I've got a link, which I think is a pretty good, and you know, it's about 8 minutes, I think, the YouTube video, which I've been using for a while now in some of my macro courses, but because I think it's really interesting. Now, it may get into some areas that are where we want to cover in this course, but nonetheless, I do think it's a fairly interesting view of his perspective of his ideas and what he was talking about. But Keynes was an interesting character. He was a British economist, and was notable early on for having a knack for putting one thing together with another thing, and the idea of connecting events. This thing leads to another, which leads to another, which leads to another. This is, by the way, that sort of reasoning, that sort of logic carries over even to the present day. So for those of you who may take further macro courses, you'll see how we say one thing changes, and it affects this, and affects that, and affects that. The idea of sort of a kaleidoscopic view of the world. For anybody who's ever looked in a kaleidoscope, I think we all know what it is. You turn the wheel a little bit, and you don't just have one change of one piece of glass moving, you have everything moving. And so as a result, things are moving, okay? Things are moving, and that's what makes macroeconomics a bit complicated and why policy doesn't always get it right. This is why we're debating what our government should do with interest rates next month. And there's a substantial amount of debate as within the economics field as to whether or not the government's doing too much, too little, are they too late, are they too early? And I know this drives everyone crazy that economists don't agree. And maybe we'll get a little bit more clarity on this, but right now there's a substantial amount of disagreement. Well, there's certainly disagreement as to how the world got itself in a Great Depression in the 1930s. And this is where Keynes's work comes into play. By the way, let me just back up a little bit here. And when I talk about his notion of putting things together, one thing leading to another, just a bit of background, just to sort of let you know how agile Keynes's mind was and how he was really a forward thinker. He was a Cambridge economist, Cambridge University, who was attached to the Treasury at the Versailles Peace Conference. For those of you who have followed history in World War I, the Versailles Conference was really the place in which the nations that were involved in World War I tried to settle their differences after the war. And the idea was that among the things that would happen was that Germany would pay substantial amounts of economic reparations, financial penalties, that would essentially punish Germany for having, quote unquote, started the war. And I say quote unquote because Germany at the time disagreed very heavily that they started any kind of a war, that they were reacting to some of the events. And this is all very, very complicated, all very controversial. And certainly was controversial afterwards because of the the substantial disagreement that Germany and the German people had after the Versailles Conference. And here's the thing. Keynes said, look, the penalties that are being imposed on Germany are excessive. In fact, and he was saying, there's no way Germany is going to be, first of all. So from a practical standpoint, it's a non-starter right out of the gate. It's like trying to collect money from somebody who doesn't have it. If they don't have it, they don't have it. You know, so as a result, what's the point of trying to collect when you're never going to collect in the first place? All it is an exercise in futility and frustration. And then the British government actually said, you know what, you need to go. So they sent him home from the Versailles Peace Conference, whereupon he wrote a book called Economic Consequences of Peace, which is a fantastic book where he goes into extreme detail about here's why Germany is not going to be able to repay these substantial reparations to the British and to the French and to the Italians and to the Americans who were the victors in the war. And he went so far as to do things like count the number of train cars, count the number of adult males who were still in the workforce. It was mostly a male workforce at that time. Counted the amount of grain production, the amount of coal deposits. I mean, it's just an unbelievable bit of analysis into Germany's productive capacity. He said, there's no way Germany's going to be able to do it. And furthermore, what they're probably going to do is they're probably just going to print more money. Now, if you've ever wondered why the government doesn't just print more money and drop $1 million on your doorstep by UPS, there's a reason why, and it's because if money is no more difficult to get than the government UPSing it to your door, then it doesn't become. And so as a result, prices go up because goods go flying off shelves, obviously, now that everyone's got $1 million. And so as a result, we have massive inflation. That's essentially what Germany did post-World War I, was inflate its currency. And so whenever you hear the term hyperinflation, it's almost always associated with that condition of the early 1920s in Germany, where the German government just simply printed currency in order to be able to pay reparations. But they're paying with devalued marks. The currency at the time was the German mark. And as a result, their economy went crashing to the ground. Furthermore, Keynes didn't stop there. He said what's going to happen is the Germans are not going to be able to repay it. They're going to probably inflate their currency, and it's going to wreck their economy. And then furthermore, this is going to be actually in Germany, that probably what's going to happen is you're going to have a new government, and whatever World War I was the first half of whatever is coming, that we're sort of in a halftime situation. We'll have another war as a result within a generation. And sure enough, within a generation, another war did happen. Germany certainly got another government that needs no introduction, the Nazi government. But think about this, in 1919, he was a good 20 years before World War I actually happened, and he sounded like a complete lunatic, was in disgrace, and yet he published this book, which became quite well known and quite popular. Now, why do I bring all this up? It's because of the fact that Keynes demonstrated this ability to put things together, to really analyze and to dig into the facts, to determine what is going on. That rather than just sitting back and looking from a distance at what's happening, he really got into the nitty-gritty. I mean, in the economic consequences of the peace, he was counting the number of train cars that there were, the amount of track that was available, the amount of gold and silver that were on deposit. I mean, these are things that economists really weren't doing, was sort of getting under the hood and looking at what's going on with the engine. And as a result, finding the whole situation wanting. Well, this is sort of where he's coming from in the Great Depression. And his major work was published in 1936. And I'll get to that here in just a minute. It was called The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money. It was sort of right in the middle of the Great Depression. And because when we come back to this idea of crisis economics, that was certainly a crisis, particularly for the industrial world. And that was the idea that the economy had basically crashed. And why? Well, it goes no further than the back end of a boom-bust cycle. The 1920s, particularly for the United States and Canada, were boom times, and easy money, low interest rates, lots of speculation on stocks and real estate. But the party came to an end because it was probably too easy money. Then as a result, nobody really wanted to do anything. And so as a result, people just sort of hunkered down, and the Great Depression lasted year after year after year after year. And there was no easy way out of it. And in hindsight, now it's very easy to look at the governments of the world and say they made a lot of dumb mistakes, and that the blame should be put on the Herbert Hoover in the United States and the British government in Britain for not doing what it should have done, what we now know is important to do. But it's one thing to say now that we know what the correct solutions are, it's another thing to go back and say that they should have done that when they didn't know what they didn't know. So I know Herbert Hoover in this country gets a bad rap. He gets a bad rap for not really having managed the early stages of the Great Depression very well, but he didn't know what he didn't know. And so I think that he can be a little bit forgiven on that subject. But here's what Keynes was saying is that if everyone hunkers down and does not spend money, then we've got a serious problem, okay? And so Keynesian economics sort of arose out of this crisis of the 1930s. And if you think about what conditions were, let's just take from the standpoint of the United States, unemployment rate in the United States as a whole, as best as can be measured. I mean, we're talking about an era in which there was no television. A lot of people didn't have telephones, and so surveys were really difficult to get at. There were no employment benefits that existed at the time. Social Security had only been introduced, and that was really not too much underway until sort of midway through the Great Depression. There were welfare systems by which we could track people. Today, we're going to talk more about unemployment, what unemployment's about, and we'll talk later in the class when we get to the piece on economic poverty about unemployment. We can measure it much more accurately today because when people become unemployed, one of the things that they do is they make their presence known because of filing for unemployment benefits or filing for other sorts of public assistance that sort of puts them on the radar, but they weren't on the radar. So when we say 25% unemployment in the United States, that's really an estimate. In fact, some of the estimates are it was much higher. And the other thing too is that then and now, frankly, the payroll numbers are mostly what we call non-farm payrolls. That is, those who work and live on farms and ranches. It's still not very easy to account for them because a lot of those workers are family workers, and so it's really hard to know. Is a 16-year-old who works for his father and grandfather, is that person employed or not employed? If he's not employed in January because there's nothing to do on the farm, if it's a crop growing farm, does that make that person unemployed or not? And I come from a farm family, and so I'm very familiar with these ideas. How do you measure that? It becomes very difficult. Farm and ranch unemployment. And the fact is that, with family employment, I know that not all workers on farms and ranches are family members. I do understand that. But sometimes, the wage paying is a little bit difficult. I certainly worked on my grandfather's farm for zero wages for many, many years. I never expected to earn a wage. He never expected to pay me a wage. But so you get the idea. It's somewhat difficult. The idea is we're understating the rate of unemployment because we're then and now it's difficult to capture what is called farm and ranch employment. So we captured non-farm unemployment. 25% was probably higher in certain areas. Manufacturing had ground to a halt, and so as a result, it was a real serious economic crisis, unlike anything that had ever happened before. And by the way, I know I've said this before, but if you take a long look at economic history in the United States, prior to any kind of economic regulation, the 1800s were a period of boom, bust, boom, bust, boom, bust, where we had very serious depressions beginning 1839, 1859, the 1870s we had a horrible depression, the late 1890s, 1907. These were not just little economic recessions where the unemployment rate ticks up by 2 or 3%. We're talking about massive waves of unemployment and foreclosures and bank failures and crop failures and all kinds of things which, foreclosures on farmland and factories, all these things which were much more serious than an ordinary recession, which is simply defined as a downturn in the economy. And by the way, we just came out of a recession from the pandemic, which didn't last. In terms of the actual data, the best we can see is the recession might have lasted a whole 2 months, which, by the way, does not really, in some people's minds, doesn't qualify as a recession. And now the question is, do we enter another recession, given the fact that government is trying to slow things down because we're operating at a level beyond full employment? I'm going to talk about full employment here in a second. So Keynes really arose out of this. I'll talk more about his work in a minute. Here's what I want to do. I want to sort of compare it, though, to the classical school and neoclassical. Why do I have a slash here between classical and neoclassical? It really is the period that separates the classicists from Keynes, Keynes being this sort of intermediate character here. So I'm sort of dividing up our economic history study and everything that came really before Keynes. And by the way, we sort of lumped together Adam Smith, David Ricardo, even Karl Marx in this classical view, in this sort of classical school, that is the idea that markets work this way. And that aside from Marx's really sort of, nightmare scenarios, for the most part, I think a lot of the economists, particularly Smith and Ricardo, think that more or less markets work efficiently, and they work efficiently when they're not regulated by government, when they're not controlled, when nations can trade with each other and all this, and when politicians don't interfere. And that's an important aspect. And we talked a bit about the idea that Smith railed against politics, constantly being at war, which has all kinds of devastating consequences, not just the obvious ones, the human consequences, but the economic consequences. And so when you lump all these guys together, by the way, the term classical was coined by Keynes himself. This is a little bit audacious. He certainly had an ego. He was basically saying everybody who came before me was a little bit wrong. And we're going to sort of call them the classicists with a capital C. So yes, it was a little bit of ego on his part. And then the Keynesian work, which by the way, Keynes was sort of a revolutionary figure in the way we think about economics. And I'll get into more of the specifics of that in just a minute. And then after Keynes died in 1946, all the contemporaries are what we call neoclassicists, who sort of adhere to some of the ideas that really began with Smith and Ricardo, the idea that markets work mostly efficiently and that government should have a limited role to play. And sometimes government has a tendency to do too much. And we're going to talk a bit about the work of Milton Friedman in particular, who said, look, government means well, but they oftentimes do too much. And as a result, they make a mess of things unintentionally, but even though it's unintentional, it still has the same result. So classicism really sort of held sway from about the 1970s really until maybe the late 90s in this country, early 2000s. And the Keynesians kind of made a comeback. Keynes was sort of faded a little bit, but the classicists were on the upswing. And that today's Keynesians they really call themselves mainstream. They're sort of trying to regain the ground here and say, we're the mainstream thinkers. We adhere back to the work of Keynes, where government does have a role to play. And by the way, if you want to distinguish between these two schools, we're going to be talking about this not only today, but also into next week, and whatever we carry over from next week into week 9, we'll do so. But the main determining and differentiating factor here is this idea of where government fits into the picture. That's really the distinguishing characteristic, that if there's one main subject that divides these two broad schools of thought, it's the role of government. And what is the proper role of government? Going back to this idea of what government should do versus what government does do. And remember the term normative economics. A normative economic statement is a statement of what should be, which again is subjective. It's subject to disagreement. It's controversial at times. And people can disagree over what it means. What should government be doing? What should government not be doing? Those are the questions which really are at sort of the heart and at sort of the main topic here. So let's talk a bit about Keynes and the Keynesians, okay? This is because Keynes himself only lived about another 10 years after he published his major work, which was published in 1936. It's called the general theory, and it is a demand side theory. And that is interesting because there was so much discussion in years and decades and generations leading up to the 1930s, where most of the focus was on the supply side, frankly. And in fact, if you had taken an economics course in a college prior to the Great Depression, it would have been focused a lot on what we would think of as microeconomics, dealing a lot with the business firms and the problems that business firms have in competing with each other, cost of production, profits, what the competitive environment looks like, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, the very term macroeconomics really was sort of created, and the concept of macroeconomics came out of this experience of the Great Depression. And there's a lot of debate that rages to this day as to who actually coined the term macroeconomics, macro meaning big picture. Was it Keynes himself? Was it Ragnar Frisch, a Norwegian economist? It doesn't really matter. My point is that macro didn't exist as a thing until around the Great Depression. All economics was pretty much microeconomics based, and it is the study of markets. The idea being that an economy was what? An economy was just simply a collection of all markets. That was the thinking. Keynes was saying, no, it's more than that, that the sum is greater than that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That there are things that we need to focus on specifically in macroeconomics, that if we don't do that, then we're going to miss the point, and we're not going to be able to create and solve these crises as they occur. By the way, Keynes was saying, look, classical thinkers, if markets work efficiently, and if they get out of whack, they get back in whack. If they get out of whack, they get themselves back out of trouble. Then why hasn't the economy, after all these years, the Great Depression, which started roughly around 1929, 1930, why by 1936 is the unemployment rate so high globally, not just in the United States, not just in Europe, but elsewhere in the world? Why is the unemployment rate so stubbornly high? And why can't we fix that problem? Just look out your window, is what he's saying. If your theories about efficient markets were so strong, then why do we have this particular crisis that we can't seem to figure out what to do about? And so this was really a pushback against some of the existing theory of the time. And by the way, I know that sometimes Keynes is sort of likened to being a sort of follower of Marx. I know even when I was an undergraduate, we had students who sort of thought, because in those days, Keynes was sort of on the downswing a little bit. He didn't really get revived until the early part of this turn of this century. And a lot of people were sort of down on Keynes, saying he was mostly a depression theorist. He was sort of an adherent of Marx. Nothing could be further from the truth. Keynes was not a Marxist. In fact, was very critical of Marxist thinking. And by the way, if you look at Keynes' own background as an economist, he was also a very wealthy stock speculator. He was on the board of directors of an insurance company. He was director of a bank. He was a very wealthy individual. I really doubt that you can label him as some sort of Marxist. I don't think that really made a lot of sense to do that. So, and in fact, he was very critical of the idea that Marxist thinking seeks to simply level the playing field and doesn't reward talent. So I think that's probably an exaggerated criticism of Keynes when they sort of lump him in there. So later additions to the theory, which is why we call this the Keynesians, were frankly mostly Americans, with the exception of John Hicks, who was a British subject, Samuelson in the United States, James Tobin, Kenneth Arrow, including what we now call the neo-Keynesians, who are sort of also now known somewhat as the mainstream economists. They're sometimes known as sort of informally as saltwater economists. And where does that term come from? It's due to the fact that in this country, their concentration tends to be heavily on both coasts, particularly on the East Coast in the United States, Harvard, MIT, Yale, to some extent on the West Coast. But Stanford in there, although Stanford is not as clearly in the Keynesian camp, a lot of very conservative economists who have not really adhered to Keynes very much, including Milton Friedman himself, who we'll talk about next week, John Taylor, who's another very contemporary, still living and is at Stanford, who I don't think you would categorize as a true Keynesian, but nonetheless, we certainly have this idea of the Keynesians being, for whatever reason, congregated on both coasts. Now, when we get into the talk about the classicists, we'll refer to them as freshwater economists because they tend to be focused around the Midwest, and we'll get into that a bit more. So that's, if you ever get in terms of saltwater economists, that's really who we're really talking about there. Okay, so that's essentially what that means by the saltwater economists. So let's talk a bit about the tenets of Keynesian theory, what it's about here. And I apologize if this is small on the screen for you to see. Maybe you can blow it up on your own screen the best you can. I've posted these in Brightspace. All the PowerPoints are now up to date and current. I wanted to go back and I had to do some sort of shuffling of these because I wanted to make sure that they sort of matched up with the weeks in which they were scheduled. What I have found with PowerPoint slides is that if our schedule gets a little bit out of whack for whatever reason, time constraints or whatever, and in spring semesters we have things like snow days and whatnot, then they won't match what's being talked about. So I want to make sure that we have these match the actual weeks that we discuss these in class. And so let's talk about the tenets or the main principles of Keynesian theory, and then I'll talk a bit about employment and why that's a big issue. And so we'll talk about this idea of GDP. First of all, I want to define the term GDP, gross domestic product. That term may be familiar to some of you. Let's define what it is. Gross domestic product is defined as the total output of goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. And you'll find the definition in many places in your text. I think chapter 6 is probably a great place to go and look if you want a full discussion of gross domestic product is GDP. Nice figure. So a few minutes ago when I said the US economy produces $24 trillion of output, what I'm saying is the US economy produces somewhere around $24 trillion expected this year, 2022, in total output of goods and services. And the measurement of these is beyond where we want to go in this course. For those of you who will go on to take macro, which hopefully some of you do, we'll get into some pretty deep detail, a deep dive as to where we come up with these numbers of $24 trillion, or whatever the number is. It's not going to round, obviously, but 24 with 12 zeros, but it's, you know, that's roughly where we are. So that's the important figure. That's the top line figure of what goes on. And from there, all production becomes someone's income, because if I produce a good and sell it, that's the way that we go on the scoreboard, is we produce some good. Then the income from that must flow somewhere as income, whether it flows to a business firm, whether it flows to a household, or whether it even goes to government. We don't know, the government, we don't say earns an income, but the government does collect the tax revenue. So government does collect a piece of the action, if you like. So that's the first thing. And we'll talk more about the unemployment bit here in a second. So here are some of the main ideas, the main principles of Keynesian theory. The first is that economies are inherently unstable. They're inherently unstable. What does Keynes mean by this? Okay, it is a pushback from some of the originalist thinking that says that all economies are simply collections of individual markets. And the individual markets, if they get knocked out of equilibrium, remember we said equilibrium is this condition in which there's no shortage in a market, and there's no surplus in a market. That if there's a shortage or surplus, it's a temporary condition. And I know that we've all kind of come through the pandemic, and I know we talked, very understandingly about this idea of shortages that we saw during the pandemic. You couldn't buy Clorox wipes, or you couldn't buy bleach, or whatever for a time. Well, that was short-lived, wasn't it? Those shortages are mostly solved. Now, we still have shortages, yes, we do, particularly on manufactured goods, what we call intermediate parts that go into things, particularly on high-tech goods. Yes, there are still shortages, but those will probably be corrected at some point. Classical economic thinking says that if there's a shortage or there's a surplus, overproduction, the market will work itself out so that we get back into equilibrium. Equilibrium is this sort of natural state of balance, right? And by the way, look around nature, there are things like we have an equilibrium body temperature, right? Yes, our temperature might spike to 100 degrees, but it will get it will get itself back to 98.6 or thereabouts. But it won't happen right away. It will work its way back to equilibrium. And there are equilibrium conditions all throughout nature, and that's essentially the idea of what equilibrium is this state of nature. And by the way, it's not just goods and services, but it's also labor. If there's unemployment, which is defined as a surplus labor, the theory in classical economics says this: okay, I'm unemployed and I'm looking for a job. I was making, say, $15 per hour, but now I really need work because I'm making $0 per hour. I'm willing to take a pay cut, and firms are willing to pay less per worker because they don't have to, because there are many more of us needing jobs than there are them demanding jobs, and willing to pay us less. But I, as an unemployed worker, am willing to take less. I'll take $10 per hour because I need the work, because my income right now is zero. And so as a result, workers will take a lower wage to go back to work. As a result, unemployment fixes itself because workers simply accept a lower wage. As that market grows, wages will rise naturally. As the economy grows, workers' wages will rise. And so that problem will take care of itself without the need for government intervention. And by the way, the classicists argue against things like minimum wage laws. I know it's always very controversial. It's really one of the longest running arguments everywhere in economics is minimum wage laws. But let's set that to the side for right now. The idea is, though, that the classicists were saying that all these market instabilities are temporary. They'll fix themselves. And by the way, when an economy gets into a recession or a depression, A recession is just simply defined as a drop in economic activity. A depression is a much deeper drop. It's oftentimes due to something that's broken in the economy, whether it's the financial system or whether it's crop failures, bad weather, pandemic, right? These kinds of things that the economy suffers a major blow. But then it will pick itself back up and recover without the need for government intervention, because it's considered to be unhelpful. Even though the intentions are good, it doesn't always work. Well, Keynes was saying, no, frankly, markets are not stable. They're inherently unstable, and so are the economies that constitute them. So as a result, we cannot count on private markets alone to do the job. And that they don't always operate at full employment. They can become stuck in what he calls an underemployment equilibrium. And he brought to the fore something that I know that for those of you who will take macro, certainly my courses, I will talk a lot about this idea that macroeconomists for years have used these automotive metaphors to describe macroeconomic life and macroeconomic policy. And that is the idea that Keynes referred to this as operating in first gear. I know that a lot of people drive automatics, and so first gear is not obvious to them, but there is a first gear in a car. And if you're driving a stick, first gear is, just to kind of get you going and whatnot, but it's not very efficient. And he likened it to driving the economy in first gear. Now, could you take a long drive in a stick shift in first gear? Let's say you want to go to Las Vegas. You do it all the way in first gear? Yeah, you could, I suppose. It's not very efficient. It's going to take you a long time. You're probably going to do lots of damage to your car by doing it. It's not very efficient. In other words, it's a very unstable situation. You don't want to do it, even though you probably theoretically could get yourself all the way to Las Vegas in first gear. Maybe those who are a little bit more familiar with engines would say, no, you can't even get the gallop in first gear. But nonetheless, you get the idea theoretically, but it's not very efficient. In other words, you're operating, and even though you might be at a constant 5 miles per hour, right? So just like 25% unemployment that stays constant is in equilibrium. You're definitely at equilibrium. Nothing is changing. That's what equilibrium is. But 25% unemployment is not satisfactory. It's not efficient. And therefore, it's an unstable situation that itself needs to be fixed through outside intervention. So economies don't always operate at full employment. They can become stuck. And this idea of things becoming stuck is an important part of what Keynes is talking about in the general theory, that things don't always work as efficiently and as smoothly, that the economy itself is not this well-oiled machine, that they're not self-correcting. Self-correction is really sort of the heart of a lot of classical thinking. And by the way, we'll come back to it next week and talk a bit about the idea that a lot of economists believe that it is self-correcting and that government intervention is not needed. But right now, we're talking about Keynes. The idea is that they're not self-correcting. And then furthermore, demand and supply themselves, this is maybe a little bit redundant, are unpredictable and unstable. That sort of goes without saying, but here we're sort of taking this from a macro view down to the micro view. He's drawing down into the micro and saying that demand and supply themselves are unpredictable and unstable. We can't count on it. And just look at certain goods that come and go in terms of popularity, right? There are all kinds of goods that get, number one, replaced by other goods. So flip phones, I suppose, are probably still sold, but not many people want them because the smartphone, iPhone model is out there. It is considered by, I think, most of us to be superior. And so as a result, those goods get replaced by other goods. But also, goods come and go because they're no longer needed, because they're replaced by some other technology. Nobody buys cassette tapes anymore to listen to music. Those are replaced by DVDs, which have been replaced by other technology, which may be replaced at some point by new technology. And so as a result, markets are changing. And then sometimes they're unpredictable. Sometimes we just don't know what's coming. It's really hard to know. I think if you had asked my parents are no longer living, but if you told them that, by 2030, some X percentage of cars in the United States would be fully electric, that you just charge them, I think they would probably be shocked and would probably disbelieve it. Now, we're not to 2030 yet, and we'll see. And I know we're not, there are a lot of infrastructure issues that go along with that. But nonetheless, you get the idea. It's really hard to predict the future. Now, by the way, a lot of economists hold themselves out as these soothsayers, these fortune tellers, that this is exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. When in fact, Keynes was saying, anybody who tells you that really doesn't know what they're talking about. we can make educated guesses, but these educated guesses need to be just that, educated. We've got to drill into this idea of demand and supply to find out what is going on in order for us to make a broader discussion about the economy itself. Household and business spending. So these are the two actors that constitute the private sector. They can't always be counted on to boost the demand of the economy. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, particularly when we talk about full employment. Furthermore, the prescription is increases in demand through higher government spending can get us to a full employment condition. And the caveat there is without inflation. Now, this, by the way, opens the door to what will become later criticisms of Keynes's work. And that was the idea that he failed to anticipate the inflation that came about in the 1960s and 1970s. And yet I think that had he lived longer, he might have anticipated it and said, okay, it's one thing to have government to do its job. It's another thing to have government let off the gas. Now, by the way, so I give Keynes a little bit of credit for saying, look, he's only talking about the situation when the economy is very much unstable. And that, by the way, actual GDP is less than full employment GDP. That's really what he is talking, because it was the times in which he was living. I think had he lived a bit longer, he would have maybe recognized that, okay, government, you can lift off the gas finally, right? Again, coming back to these automotive metaphors, which, by the way, is a criticism that Friedman had, was that sometimes government gets involved and just doesn't know when to stop. And Friedman, and we'll get to his work where he says, look, we create a government agency that never goes away. Maybe we create an agency to solve a particular problem and then just never dies. It just continues to go on. It has perpetual life, even though it's maybe no longer needed. This is why we have criticisms of government agencies from time to time that we wonder what they actually do. More on that a bit later. So the idea is that when we talk about, and there's a reason why then we got into this discussion of these definitions of government policy, it's so that we can get to this idea of theory so that we know what we're talking about. Monetary policy, which is defined as the management of the supply of money and the availability of credit, then it's not really effective in Keynes's view because actual GDP can be less than full employment GDP and it can stay there. And what he's really talking about is this. So think about what monetary policy is all about. And we're going to come back to it a bit later. I just wanted to, so we know what it is as we're talking about it. It's the management of the supply of money and the availability of credit. And let's focus on that last one. Money is created in various means. Number one, the government can create money out of whole cloth, and it certainly has done that in the last 20 years or so. Now it's starting to reel it back in. It's trying to shrink the money supply, but it can do it that way, or it can be done through lending. So every time you borrow money, you're basically creating new money in the economy. And you might think, well, how does that happen? Because all I'm doing is borrowing from someone else's savings. That's true, but that person's savings never really went away. They can still get out their savings. You know, you're not parting with it and saying it's gone, bank, you know, when you make a bank deposit. But so money can be created through borrowing. Here's the problem, though. What if banks don't want to lend money? Because banks themselves are in such dire straits, they don't want to lend money because they don't want to take risks. This was precisely the case of the Great Depression. Banks did not want to lend money. And as a result, they did not lend money. And in fact, if anything, they were trying to collect money that was already owed to them. This is why you had massive amounts of foreclosures. And in the case of the farm economy, there's about a 50% foreclosure rate, a very high rate of foreclosure, because banks are required to get their money back through lending money. So if banks can't create money through that function, then it doesn't matter what the interest rate is. People aren't, if they can't borrow, then it doesn't matter what the rate is. It makes no, if it's zero, it doesn't make any difference. So as a result, it's ineffective if banks can't or won't lend money, or if people don't want to borrow money. If people don't want to borrow money, you can't make people borrow money. That's really one of the issues with monetary policy. Instead, fiscal policy, which is the budget function of taxation and, more importantly, government spending, is what is the preferred policy tool. So let's talk a bit about this tool, this mechanism here, by which government is seeking to push the economy to full employment. So let me sort of swivel the screen here a bit here, and oops, wrong way. I know I do this every time, and I can't seem to quite get this. Okay, so here we go. So let me bring up the lights here a bit. So what I've got here on this board is simply an axis, okay? So it's just simply an axis, which we're going to call the GDP axis, which runs somewhere between 0 and infinity, okay? That's GDP. So, and GDP is expressed as a dollar figure, or if we're talking about the US economy, or if we're talking about European economies that are denominated in euros, it would be euros, or in Japan, we could be talking about yen or whatever. So all we're simply saying is somewhere on this continuum from 0 to infinity is the output of goods and services. And we're saying that there is a GDP level that we call full employment. We'll simply call it GDP sub FE, okay? Now, what Keynes is saying is that there could be a gap here, and that we could have GDP, which is actual GDP here. And is what's called an output gap. And that is when actual GDP is less than full employment GDP. And what does that mean? It means the economy is underperforming. Because, and where do we get to this full employment GDP? It's the unemployment rate that's associated with a GDP that achieves that full employment rate. What is full employment? We're going to talk a bit more about what the definition of full employment is. By the way, in economics, economists, we think of full employment as being labor full employment, and for obvious reasons, and that's certainly the most obvious form of unemployment, but economists have a little bit more comprehensive view of unemployment and full employment. And that is, it's not just labor that's working to its full capacity, it's also buildings and machinery and transportation equipment all operating to their capacity, which doesn't mean 100% capacity, because in the case of machinery and equipment, there's downtime and whatnot. Factories not all operate 24 hours a day. People don't work 52 weeks a year. There is some downtime. So that is sort of built into the system. But we'll talk more about what the concrete definition of labor full employment is, and we'll get to that a bit later. Okay, we'll get to that a bit later in the course. Okay, so there's a full employment, a gross domestic product, dollar amount of output that corresponds to quote unquote full employment when machine equipment and plants and property and people are operating at more or less full employment. But then there's an actual, and there's this gap that needs to be filled. And what Keynes is saying is, even if there were boosts to the economy through household spending, okay? So let's say there's an increase in household spending. It might not get you there, right? For whatever reason. It might get you part of the way there, but not all the way there. And maybe the government could offer something like lower interest rates. Maybe now we have an increase in uptick in business spending. But that might not get you there either. And so the critical piece is what gets you to where you need to get, and that is an increase in government spending, right there. So an increase in government spending is really what the answer is. And this is when Keynes talked about this idea that government just simply needs to spend money. Spend money on what? Keynes is saying it doesn't make any difference, really, what government spends money on, as long as it pushes the economy to full employment, because households and businesses can't do it. They can't be relied upon to push the economy to full employment. Because if they could be relied upon, we're now 6 or 7 years into a Great Depression. If they would have done it, they would have already done it. If they could have done it, they would have already done it. Well, they didn't do it. So now government spending is needed. Now, by the way, when Keynes says it doesn't really make any difference what we spend money on as government spending, he's being very literal. And in fact, he gets into this idea that, really sort of leads to a lot of his critics, parodying his work, because he would say, look, if the government hired 100 people to dig a hole in the first shift and 100 people in the second shift to fill the hole back up, it's still better than doing nothing whatsoever. And of course, then that leads to all kinds of charges. Well, that sounds like a real government operation, right? Nothing is achieved. All it is spending. But he's saying, okay, yes, it's spending. It doesn't really achieve anything, but it does achieve the macro goal of putting people to work. Those people earn wages. They spend money on goods and services that they wouldn't have before. Firms that now had goods that they weren't selling now are selling them, which means they have to reorder from the makers of those goods, who now have to increase their production. And all along that value chain leading back to the ultimate consumer, more workers are being hired, more wages are being earned, translating into more spending, more production, on and on and on. This so-called virtuous cycle. At least that's the benefit that's being created. Now, Keynes was not so so blind as to say, okay, it's one thing. I mean, he had some other scenarios like the government could even benefit from burying a bottle of diamonds in a mountain. I mean, I don't know where he gets this idea of a bottle of diamonds, but anyway, that's one of the scenarios. And that firms could compete. Whoever got the diamonds then would be paid off, and it would be the reward for the firm, but all along the line, even those who weren't successful or at least paying workers sought to do that. Well, all that sounds a little bit silly, but when Keynes is saying, okay, government spending, maybe rather than doing things like digging holes and filling them back up and burying diamonds in mountains, maybe government should do things like things that have a long-term value to the economy, like rebuilding infrastructure like rail lines and roads and bridges and canals and deep water ports and rural electrification. By the way, in the 1930s, rural electrification was a big issue. The government spent lots of money to try to string power lines to places that didn't have electricity. So for the first time, electricity arrived. Phone lines that didn't arrive in a lot of places, even in some urban areas, there were no telephones through that period. The government invested a lot in order to get that to happen. And so a lot of these programs that were done by the Roosevelt administration in the US were really efforts to try to push the economy to full employment. And there was incremental recovery. It didn't really get to full employment ever during that first 8 years of the Roosevelt administration. Obviously, Franklin Roosevelt was elected twice more. And what really got the economy to full employment, and maybe even then some, was World War II, which was nothing economically, was certainly a government spending program, among other things. I know World War II is an historical event, obviously, but from an economic standpoint, it really got the economy to full employment. And then some, and I say then some because we had women that are in the workforce, sometimes for the very first time, entering this industrial economy, working not at home, but working away from home, which really is the definition of industrialization, going to work outside of household labor, and really was an empowering feature of the economy at that time. The economy was sort of pushing beyond full employment. If you're adding workers to the labor force that didn't exist before, that means you're certainly pushing the boundaries. And so economic performance was pushed along by that. Now that might not be the way to get there. And I think that, I know that I have said this before, but I certainly grew up in a time and place in which people were saying, if the economy is not doing well, we need a war. I think that's a really bad solution. I think that it's a very limited example that World War II in this country was a much different experience than World War II in a lot of other countries. Most other countries that were involved in World War II do not want that again to happen at all. So the war didn't happen here, and I think that's essentially why. So I don't think that's always the solution. But if government can do something that's productive, and by the way, hasn't Joe Biden, his administration, done a lot of things to try to push what we call stimulus? This is all we call stimulus, these additional incremental increases to government spending. We're not saying government goes from zero to something. Government was already spending, but we're talking about incremental increases in government spending, marginal increases that therefore boost the economy and move it to full employment. And certainly President Biden has been very active at trying to increase stimulus, probably to the point where at the moment we are almost certainly beyond full employment. I think there's absolutely no question about it. Our unemployment rate as of the last data from September or from August was about 3.5% labor unemployment. That is an extremely low rate of unemployment, and it's probably not sustainable in the long run, which is why the government's looking to slow things down. Not the elected side of the economy, but the monetary side of the economy by raising interest rates. And we'll talk a bit more about that as we get a little bit deeper into the course. But this is essentially Keynesianism in a nutshell, is the idea that you cannot count on the private sector, the blue and the green here, which are just arbitrary colors for the private sector, that they can't be counted upon because they only get part of the way there. And it will be stuck, it might be an equilibrium, but it's in first or second gear. But instead, to get all the way to the top speed, we need government to be in there. And the government is actually a part of us. We control government, particularly democratic systems. And so we want government to fix these problems. And by the way, I think a lot of people who may sort of philosophically disagree with government's involvement in the economy in this particular way, and I know that we certainly bring this up in our discussion question, should government be involved in this particular way? There are a lot of people who think the government does not have a role to play in this. That yes, we'll get to full employment eventually, but that involving government and raising government spending causes its own problems in the long term that are unanticipated. So as a result, maybe government should not. again, this is what makes economics what it is. The idea of no real unanimity on the role of government and what government should be doing. By the way, this long term is really the sort of crux of what we call classical economic thinking. And we're going to get into that beginning next week. Whereas Keynes is really more concerned with the short run. In fact, Keynes himself is sort of famous for saying, when asked about the long run and the long run consequences of his proposals, he said, in the long run, we're all dead. That was his famous quote, in the long run, we're all dead. So Keynes very definitely would be considered a short run theorist in this particular regard. So anyway, that sort of does Keynes and gives you an idea of what his theories are about, sort of in a nutshell. And we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left. Does anyone have any questions for me about anything in the time we've got remaining? We've only got about 3 minutes, but that's certainly enough time to answer any questions. Okay, well, if you do have things to give me, feel free to get with me individually, and glad to help as always. And I'm pretty much here every day, so feel free to get with me as you need to. So anyway, all this material is available. There's also, I think there's an easy to watch video. It's somewhat entertaining, produced by a sort of a think tank, kind of the British equivalent of our Khan Academy, that I've posted the link to, which I think you'll find interesting. I think it gives a very well balanced view of what Keynes's theories are. That link is available in the module 7, week 7 module in Brightspace. So feel free to have a look at that. And if there are no questions, we'll call it a day. So feel free to get with me if you do have questions for me individually. Otherwise, have a great rest of your week.